All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. If you notice the invite a little bit different, we didn't come into this with a specific topic. Really wanted to hear what you're dealing with, what you might have questions for us. That's why we have both Jen and Brad on. So whether it's legal or legislative or association in nature, whether it's questions to each other so that you guys can talk about what's happening in your districts and maybe how each of you are handling certain situations. I'll start like it seems like I've started for the last almost 2 years now and just say thank you to everybody for the work that you're doing, whether you're a superintendent or a board member. This has been a heavy lift. Really worried about what we see in the next year as we go into an election cycle with school board members, and really trying to encourage people to stay the course and rerun. If you've been on the board for a while, you know that this is not common to board service, and just really hope that you are able to stick it out and understand that what you're doing in your communities is worth continuing. And ultimately, if it is time to retire from board service, that as a district, you really work on that recruitment space to make sure that you have good candidates that are going to be student focused running for the board. I think that's going to be more important this election coming up next year than probably any that we've faced before in that space. We're seeing recall efforts on school board members right now, and I think we just, as much as we can, need to stick together and support each other, and have your association support all of you in the service that you're providing in your districts. The other thing I'll mention before I just kind of open it up for general questions, and if nobody does, then I'll talk to Jen and Brad a little bit about stuff, but is that annual conference is only about 3 weeks away now. Right now we are just under, we have to do a hard cap this year on registrations from a social distancing and space requirement. We don't want to pack those rooms too tightly. And we're offering it as a hybrid option, as you know, so you can go completely online. We're at about 430, 440 registrations. We're going to cap it at 500. Even though we could fit more people into the place, we just are not going to go in that direction. And even setting up things within the property to watch kind of the social distancing space. You may have seen we've communicated out, I know, on our website and to more recent registrants that we have decided to do a mask requirement during the conference. Putting 500 people in one room together just does not seem like a prudent thing to do at this point, especially as Michigan's numbers continue to be higher than what much of the country is. So, but we'll have lots of flexibility. It's going to be great to see people in person again and talk. Not that I don't love seeing all of you in your little Hollywood square, but really prefer the in-person interaction with all of you. So if you haven't registered yet and you're still considering it, you might want to throw your name in soon or risk the chance of at least not being able to do the face-to-face. We are not capping, of course, the online registration portion of it.
Hey, Don, and if it fills up on Friday and Saturday, I think there's still plenty of available in-person spots on Thursday for like the Council of School Attorneys Conference. So yeah, look at other days if you can't get in on Friday and or Saturday for the in-person part of it.
That's a great reminder, Brad. We've got Brad and the Council of School Attorneys on Thursday for an early bird. We have a DE&I session as an early bird also that Thursday. And the other thing to be aware of is all of the CBA classes that are being offered during conference weekend are in person only. We're not doing those in hybrid in any fashion. It's just too difficult to do it live and hybrid at the same time. We will be in December offering another CBA weekend that will be virtual. And so that for those that are going to attend virtually, that will be a way for you to do that. And for others that want to just and have access to other classes will have that opportunity. But otherwise, the CBAs themselves will all be in person at the conference. So I'm going to quit talking and see what all of you are interested in, what's going on in your districts that you might need some guidance on, questions that you want to pose to some of your colleagues and peers to see how they're maybe dealing with similar situations. Everything's fair game today.
We already have a question in the chat, Don.
Well, I guess I should have. Well, for whatever reason in the chat, it's not showing up for me.
Oh,
You
okay.
probably
Actually, it's a
got it.
direct message to me. I'm sorry. So I will go ahead and answer this. An issue came up at our last meeting when the crowd got unruly and our president said we were taking a recess. Several in the crowd said it was a violation of the Open Meetings Act and Robert's rules. Were we required to take a vote? Is there an actual consequence to not calling a recess correctly? We did come back in a few minutes later, finished public comment, heard from everyone. Our public participation policy does say that the presiding officer may call for a recess or an adjournment. Okay, this is a really good question. So first of all, you may call for a recess. It doesn't have to be included in your public comment policy, okay, or your public comment rules. And what appears here, it looks like the president called a recess by consent. So to me, that's the most efficient way to call a recess. You could ask the board as board president, is there any objection to taking a recess? And then if no one objects, then by consent, the board has agreed, unanimously to take a recess. Now, if a board member does object to taking that recess, then you put a motion before the board on voting to go into recess. And another important element here is that you want to make sure you don't mistakenly adjourn the meeting rather than recessing the meeting. Because here you had a board that still needed to finish up its public comment. It did not want to adjourn that meeting. Because if you adjourn the meeting, it's over, it's done with. And if you adjourn a meeting without doing public comment, that violates the Open Meetings Act. So you always recess before you adjourn if you haven't completed public comment yet. And then you can recess up to 36 hours without having to repost that meeting. If you recess it more than 36 hours, then it would have to be posted as a reconvened meeting, and you'd have to give the date, location, time, and everything else that traditionally goes into a posting requirement. So I believe I answered that question. Looks like we have another question about the process for recall. Hopefully we were not going to have a lot of board members go through recall, but we've already had a number of districts in Kent County where members of their board have had recall petitions filed against them. So I probably don't have time to go into every step of the recall process, but it starts out as someone filing language against board members for their recall. And then that language has to be approved by a county election commission to make sure that it's factual and that it is clear. So someone signing that petition is put on notice of why these particular board members are being recalled. And then once it's approved by the election commission, the group that's promoting the recall has to get, I believe the number is 25% of the folks who voted in the last gubernatorial election in your school district has to get the number of signatures of that percentage. So 25% of the people who voted in the 2020 gubernatorial election, that would be the threshold requirement for getting that on the ballot. And then once it's on a ballot, it's different than it used to be. It used to be, okay, should this board member be recalled for the following reasons? Now, once it's on the ballot, it's almost like a new election. So the board members who are subject to recall will be on the ballot, and then someone has to run against them. And if no one runs against those board members who are subject to the recall petition, then they simply get reelected. So not only does this group have to get enough signatures to get on the ballot, the recall group would have to get some people to run against the incumbents who are being subject to recall. So that's a quick summary of the recall process.
Thanks, Brad. We have a few hands up. Howard, I will deal with your question that is in the chat as well, but I'm going to go with hands up first, and I'm going to start with Mary Hanser.
Greetings. Hi, everybody. So the big thing going on at our last meeting is all of the public comments regarding us now as a school board breaking the law by not following what the governor signed, saying that we can't mandate, that the county, nobody can mandate masks in schools because of the line item in the budget bill now, PA 87. So that's been the big talk of our town recently.
So what that bill or legislation did, it didn't take away the authority from your county to issue a requirement on masks or quarantining. What it did, it put a penalty provision in there for the county health department. So under the county health code, counties still clearly have the authority to issue health orders that school boards are subject to. And if that order is still out there, a district must comply with it. If it doesn't comply with it, the county can go get a court order to force school district compliance. So that budget that passed and the language that's in there did not impact a county health department's authority to issue those orders. What it does, that county would incur a penalty if the county commission doesn't reaffirm the order that's been approved by it. And there's also another provision that would penalize the county for mandating masks for individuals within or students within the school district. But again, those are penalties, and in a signing statement, the governor indicated that those provisions are unconstitutional. So it's very questionable how those penalties would be enforced against the county. But just as a result of counties feeling threatened by those possible penalties, some counties have dropped their orders. But if you're in a county that hasn't dropped their order, you have to tell your constituents you're still subject to the order. You can't ignore it. It's still a binding order under law, regardless of what was in that legislation.
And ultimately, Brad, a district can still pass a mask mandate if they choose to as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, clearly, whether there's a county order or not, under the school code, section 11A clearly states that districts have the general powers authority to pass policies, to pass rules in the interest of protecting the safety and welfare of students at school or at a school activity. And any type of rule or policy relating to COVID-19 kind of fits within that statutory authority that school boards have.
On the masking, we also had a question in the chat regarding Wayne County. They have one still in place. Language states students, staff, vendors, and visitors must wear a mask. Are they correct then in saying that a visitor or attendees at a school board meeting then would also be subject to that requirement?
Well, I've taken a little bit of different position on that. If the county order specifically doesn't identify school board meetings, I think districts need to kind of reconsider whether there is a mask requirement at their school board meetings. A number of the county health department orders, some that are still in place, some that have been rescinded, did identify school board meetings as being subject to a mask requirement. In those cases, clearly enforce that requirement. But if the order doesn't specifically identify a public meeting as requiring or being subject to the mask mandate, I'm not sure if you want to go down that path as a school board, as attempting to enforce that at your meeting. I guess one more difficult issue that you would have to deal with as a school board, and you have enough on your plate already. So that's one of the battles I'm not sure you would want to fight as a school board.
All right. Don Myers, I see you had your hand up.
Yeah. My question has to do with the federal government talking about requiring vaccinations in schools. Is there anything going on that you can see that might actually happen?
I'll defer to Jen on that one, see if she's heard anything.
So the president stated that all public employers with more than 100 employees would have to require vaccinations. The very first thing we did was try to figure out if that applied to schools. For Michigan, it does, because Michigan is considered an OSHA planned state, which means that we have adopted the OSHA standards to be our safety standards. So because we're an OSHA planned state, we are one of 22. that mandate would apply to public schools. Then there are 7 other states where their OSHA plan only applies to public employers. And so that applies to them as well. So you've got 29 states across the country that this rule will apply to. However, it's a long road to get there. OSHA is supposedly in the process of drafting it right now. Once OSHA drafts it, then it comes to the state, and my OSHA takes a look at it and determines how the state will implement the rule. They have 30 days to do that. It goes back to OSHA for approval of that plan, and then it would go into effect. So at this point, you're looking at least 60 days, if not longer, because we haven't heard that it's here yet. Last I heard, OSHA was working on it. We have sent many questions to my OSHA and OSHA, but we aren't getting questions out of the Federal Labor Department, but we've sent them to my OSHA as well. Things like, how does this affect a collective bargaining agreement? Does it have to be bargained? What do we do about contract employees? Are schools the ones in charge of making sure those people are vaccinated, or are the contractors the ones who have to ensure that? If I see one of the questions that popped up about school board members, you're not an employee of that business. So that your vaccination requirement is going to be based on where you are employed. If you work for a business that is over 100 employees, yes, you'll have to be vaccinated, but it won't fall under the employee of a school district. We're talking teachers, staff, support staff, bus drivers, all of those that would have to be vaccinated. There is, I believe, a religious exemption, but again, OSHA would have to put that in. The intent was religious exemption. And the intent was also, if you refuse to get vaccinated, you would have to test weekly, if I remember right. It's been a while since I've heard the details, but really we're just waiting on OSHA to give us the details, because everything the president said is what he would like to see. Now it's up to OSHA to put it on paper.
And Don, I know you referred to students as well, and we haven't heard anything about students. Now, in my opinion, if there is going to be a student vaccination requirement, that would be at the state level. The feds would not get involved with that. You go to the administrative rules that have been adopted by the MDHHS, and there is a rule that includes all the required vaccinations for students. So that rule would have to be amended before a COVID-19 vaccination could be applied to students.
Thank you.
Don, you asked Corcoran asked a question about state of Michigan and the hierarchy level for school districts. I put back in the chat, what do you mean by hierarchy? Because ultimately, the legislature has control through passing legislation over districts and influence, but your ISD, for example, doesn't oversee a local district. Health department, if it's Department of Health and Human Services, they do have jurisdiction over health orders in Michigan that would make districts subject to that. So I'm not quite sure where you were going with that question. You can jump on if you have the capability and ask it verbally. But that, at least I was trying to answer what you were going for. And I'll go up to Howard's question. Howard, of course, you would ask the difficult question. What Howard is asking about, he asked the question, the Pennsylvania School Board Association just recently resigned or withdrew from the National School Board Association, and kind of wonders, are other states doing that? What's happening? Jen shared with you in a News from the Capitol a couple of weeks ago, a letter sent by NSBA to President Biden, asking for kind of federal involvement in investigation of kind of some of the incidences that are happening across the country, including in Michigan, against school board members and school employees. Clearly, that language, if you followed anything in Facebook and Twitter or some of the media outlets around the country, that letter created a huge uproar. Largely, I mean, a couple of reasons. One, it looks like NSBA is specifically asking for federal law enforcement intervention in kind of school board meeting space related to parents. It then goes on to talk about some of these incidences could be domestic, could be labeled as domestic terrorism, and goes on to mention the different acts in which you can prosecute under, and they include the Patriot Act. About 4 days later, the U.S. Attorney General came out with a press statement and said that they would be moving forward at the federal level to create a task force of federal law enforcement and local law enforcement to look at this problem and see what could be done, what remedies could be brought about if any were needed. That has caused an extreme amount of pushback on a lot of state associations. It is not language that if MASB were writing a letter to this governor or anybody else, I would not have chosen to use the language that they used. I understand that NSBA represents boards across this country, and there are really some pretty significant threats against school board members, against administrators. We have actually had some of the same thing here in Michigan. And to every district that I've talked to in this space prior to the NSBA letter, they had been working with local law enforcement, whether that be to have them at board meetings, to have escorts to and from work for a superintendent or to and from a board meeting if they thought it was necessary. And that federal intervention, particularly from a national association that has championed local control and having the U.S. Department of Ed get out of the school district space over the years, has just caused problems. And so in Michigan, I've had, maybe 4 or 5, it's actually went through Jen. We've had 4 or 5 members ask about the letter from NSBA. We've had a few general citizens. I've done a couple of media interviews on it. In our state, it's been relatively quiet, and it'll be good if it stays that way. MASB wasn't in, none of the states were consulted, and when that letter went out to President Biden, we knew that we were in conversation with President Biden through NSBA about the issue, but we didn't know about the letter. For Pennsylvania, and yes, there will be more states. I think some have already dropped, but just haven't put it out in the media space. They have gotten significant pressure either from their membership or from outside parties like their state legislators that in essence force them into that position. And we are trying to interact as states with NSBA to figure out where we can go with this, to try to pull things back together and not have other states leave the federation. And of course, when a state leaves, it doesn't have to be forever. It's in this point in time. And so, and even I will tell you, some of the board of directors of NSBA have concern with what happened in that space. And the board is working with the staff at NSBA. The misfortune there is, of course, they have their executive director leave this summer. They're in an interim executive director situation. They have a couple of other staff members that are on leave on their own and not dictated by NSBA or anything like that. And so that's just put them, I think, in a little bit of a vacuum for information and long-term kind of memory and knowledge. We're fortunate here in Michigan. Don Hubler from the Macomb ISD board is on the NSBA board of directors, and he, of course, is in regular communication with NSBA about kind of where we're coming from in Michigan, concerns that we've raised regarding the letter. But NSBA has done a lot of good things over the years for school districts across the state or country and across the Michigan. And so I think at this point, we're planning on staying the course and working from within to make sure that things get addressed and that we don't end up in this situation in the future. And I feel that's much better to do when you're a part of the system as opposed to being outside of it. So hopefully that answers the question. I see a bunch of other messages popped up. I don't know if some of them are in this vein. I will look down and see what those are. But Howard, did that answer your question?
Yep, I'm all set. Thank you.
All right. Howard, I answered the question about withdrawing. Okay, so I will go back to the questions. Barb started with the question, shifting the focus future and what school boards should be doing in terms of planning. What's the position of MASB on the environmental impact of school district? And do you have a position on the importance of school districts addressing it in terms of policy, reducing the carbon footprint and curriculum? That's a really good question, Barb. You can actually look in one of our coming up at annual conference, like in our standing resolutions. I think there is some touching on kind of the environment and students and what you do within that space. You can look at that for some guidance. That comes out of the membership at large, not MASB as an organ. I mean, it is from the organization, but we typically at MASB, at least from a curriculum standpoint, all we do if we have a resolution is maybe talk about best practice or talk about, or it's voted on by the membership to take a certain space. And anything that we would do isn't specifically binding on curriculum. We do think curriculum is a local decision for districts with, boards and administration to look at outside of what, of course, Michigan law dictates, and would say that would be a space for you as a district to figure that out. And also you ask if other Michigan school boards drafted a climate action plan. So I'll do two things. One, if any member has addressed this in policy specifically in your district, throw your name and district in the chat so Barb can know that. And I'll actually ask Brad a question. In policy, Neola policy particularly, which most districts are a part of, do they even talk about anything in the climate change or environment space, Brad?
To be honest with you, Don, I'm not sure. I can present that question to my contacts at Neola and see if they have it, or have them consider drafting something if they don't.
Good. It would be, other than general curriculum policy, I'd be surprised if they get that specific, but they might have something as a kind of an alternate space in that regard. Mm-hmm. Susan answered part of the question that Ann Arbor has a sustainability committee to create a policy and plan. Let's see, Susan, and feel free to answer questions in the chat. And I see you doing that. Jen also posted that we do have a resolution encouraging LEED certified buildings. Okay, let's see. Do we have anybody else right now? Oh, there we go. Nick, virtual flexibility. Yes, Jen, I'll let you touch on this too, but we've had ongoing conversations with the Department of Ed. We can't stand where we're at today forever. Regardless of the pandemic, we need to get to a space of making it easier to count kids in the flexibility space regarding virtual learning. Otherwise, we're going to lose kids to other alternatives. But Jen, if you want to touch base on kind of your efforts in that.
Right. So we're working on a bill, Senate Bill 664. It came out of the Senate last week before last. This does create some flexibility. It builds off the memo that MDE put out, but the MDE memo still had a lot of questions about how we're supposed to handle some of these things and what some of their definitions meant. So the bill that we're looking at now is 664. It is in the House Education Committee currently. And this addresses both remote learning students and those, as they're some referred to as packet kids, those that don't have access to the internet, but you're getting educational materials to them. And so it would allow for you to count them if they are in quarantine, provided that you have a two-way interaction. Right now, it says a two-way interaction daily with the virtual kids. I know that MASSP, the secondary school principals, they are trying to get that changed to weekly or twice a week rather than daily. The one piece we're concerned about deals with the definition of being in quarantine. Otherwise, we want this bill to move and to move as quickly as possible to get the flexibility we need. We don't want to have this conversation in March when some of you who have shut down because of less than 75% attendance for, well, in Flint, it was heat. In some other districts, it's been illness. We haven't even hit winter yet. So we know that districts are going to struggle with those 6 days. So our goal is to get this done as quickly as possible. If we need to tweak it or deal with the health departments, we can do that. So to count your kid who is in quarantine, 2 things have to happen. One is they have to be in quarantine based on what now says a recommendation. We were able to get that changed. Previously, the Senate said that you had to be ordered into quarantine by the health department. We know that's not happening across the state. So now it is an order, a recommendation. They use like 5 different words to basically cover any sort of thing it could be. So if the student goes into quarantine based on the guidance of DHHS, your district, or the local health department, then you'll be able to count them. So that's step 1. Step 2 is they have to have symptoms, be COVID positive, live in a household where someone else is COVID positive, or the last piece that we need to work on is have been exposed to a cluster. And a cluster is considered 3 or more people who are COVID positive. That's the language that we are trying to change, because we know that if you, for instance, in a lower elementary classroom, a friend of mine's, a whole class was close contacted in the letter because the teacher was COVID positive. And in lower elementary, you have unvaccinated, and teachers have got to lean in on kids. So in that case, if those kids had to quarantine, the entire class couldn't be counted under the way the definition is written. Or if it's at lunch, one kid in a lunch group, he's COVID positive, all the other kids are exposed, but it's only one kid. So we've had these conversations. There was willingness in the Senate to change it, but they were trying to get it done so quickly. They told us that they would carry that information with it to the House, and we would have to make that change in the House. We don't know at this point when the House is going to take it up. The House is a bigger hill to climb than the Senate. So I highly recommend reaching out to your representatives, let them know that this flexibility is needed. And especially as we head into winter, you get 6 days for whatever they're for. And we also are seeing, like, we've got a cold going around right now. You've got more kids out for colds. You have parents who are just more cautious that they're not going to send their kid. You know, they had a fever, you gave them a Motrin, dropped the fever, you send them to school. Parents aren't necessarily doing that anymore. So you're already seeing your attendance possibly fall off, and quarantines are just going to push it over the edge for some districts. So we are working on that. We're hopeful to get that done. As I said, MDE does have a memo with guidance about how to count remote learning and things like that, but it does not apply to anyone that is not doing online learning. So this would cover both of those situations.
Thanks, Jen. I see, Don, you had a question. Can Esser funds be used for bomb sniffing dogs? That's probably a question to send to MDE to talk to them, as they will be the ones that really are having the authority. Most of this money, of course, is Title I money, which the Department of Ed looks at. I do know of districts in the dog space that have brought in dogs and incorporated them into buildings from a mental health capacity, but of course, that's not in the bomb sniffing, but more therapy dogs. And I think, from what I understand, there are districts, because mental health issues can be tied to COVID related, which that money is clearly for. And so therapy dogs, I know of some districts that are moving in that direction, but that is a much different place. And so I would encourage you to really be looking at MDE and asking very specifically on Title I. Brad, Tracy had a question about live streaming public comment and how you keep that information, or if you need to.
So with live streaming, let's say you're having a traditional in-person meeting, so you're not subject to a local state of emergency allowing you to do a full virtual meeting. So you're in person and you decide to do a one-way live stream to your community. Now, I've heard that some boards get a little pushback from their community members about, well, if you're live streaming it, why not make it two-way? That way we can participate in the meeting and we can engage in public comment, via the virtual meeting as well. I don't recommend that. because we just don't know what rules you could establish when you're allowing for public comment via virtual means when you're not following Section 3A of the Open Meetings Act, which is the new section that covers virtual meetings. So we know what the rules are for virtual public comment when you're having a virtual meeting in whole or in part, but we don't know what those rules are or would be if you're doing a traditional in-person meeting and you're doing a one-way live stream. So in regard to that, I've said it's a best practice that even if you're live streaming, require your public comment individuals to be there in person when addressing the board. And then if you are making a recording of your meeting, you are not bound to post that on your website. You're not even bound to maintain the recording of that meeting. Now, again, as a best practice, I would suggest you keep that recording until your minutes of the meeting are approved. And then once your meeting minutes are approved for that meeting, you can go ahead and destroy that meeting recording unless it's subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. If someone has made a FOIA request for that, because it is a public document under FOIA, you would have to disclose it pursuant to that request. And yeah, I don't believe there would be any reason to edit the recording. Anything sent in a public meeting is public, right? So if you're saying something about a student in a public meeting, you shouldn't be saying that if it's protected information under the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So if a community member is saying something about a student, then that's not protected under FERPA. So I wouldn't see a reason or need to go back and redact that video to protect anyone's privacy interests if someone does make a FOIA request for it.
Thanks, Brad. Don, you had your hand up again.
Yes, I'd like to know how many schools are still using COVID days instead of absences for staff.
I've gotten that question a little bit, Don, in terms of how to address that in the collective bargaining agreement. Just based on anecdotal evidence, I would probably put the number of using COVID days. This is just going by the questions I've received on it. And I think the direction that school districts are going, maybe at 25%, where you have specific days just related to COVID situations. And then the other 75% just implementing their normal, sick language provisions that they have in their CBAs. So even if you're quarantining under COVID or you have a positive COVID test, there wouldn't be a special provision in the collective bargaining agreement. You would just apply your sick days that would apply to any type of illness. But I guess I'd encourage folks in the chat, if your districts have adopted a specific COVID language for your CBAs that allow for COVID days that are different than sick days, go ahead and put that in the chat so it might give Donna an idea just based upon the representation we have here, how many districts have done that.
Brad, I see as you've been answering questions, there's a kind of a line of comments related to public comment period, and they're answering themselves, but clearly public comment periods, if you're having them virtually or in person, they are not limited to just the citizens of your district. People from outside of your district have the right in public comment to be able to address the board. And, we probably wouldn't even have thought about that 2 years ago, but it is becoming commonplace now where even, in person, people are driving sometimes long distances to do public comment at meetings. At this point, Michigan might be fortunate. I've actually seen in other states where advocate groups have actually taken buses, like charter buses, and driven to school districts to bring 50 people to make comment at a board meeting, even though none of the people on the bus are from that. Hopefully we don't see that necessarily here, because it does, I think, detract from all of you getting the business of the board done. One thing that didn't come up in chat, but I've seen raised before, Brad, somebody asked the question here, how did you know they were from outside? Here's the question to you. what information can you legally collect from a person when they go to sign in to do public comment? Is it zero information, just their name? Like, what can you ask for when they identify themselves?
Well, you can ask for a number of different, types of information, but essentially you can only require them to give their name and notice that they wish they're going to, or they intend to participate in public comment. So you look at the objective of requesting the information, and whether that is related to accomplishing some, or the rule relating to requesting the information, whether that's related to a legitimate, objective of having an orderly meeting. So as far as asking where someone lives or their contact information, not related to having an orderly meeting, might be related to following up with that person based upon what the comments that the individual makes during the public meeting. But essentially, Don, you can only require name and their intention of whether to participate in public comment, and that's enforceable according to an old Attorney General opinion and some recent case law that has come from the Sixth Circuit as well. My standard is I wouldn't go any further than having that list in place as soon as the meeting is called to order. So I would not say you have to sign up 24 hours in advance in order to participate in public comment. That, to me, that would be questionable under our Open Meetings Act. But if you require folks to sign up prior to the meeting being called to order, likely that's enforceable based upon, like I said, an Attorney General opinion written long ago that says you can adopt rules to facilitate your public comment.
Thanks. Jen, I think you said you had an Esser, a follow-up Esser in your direct messages that may be worth sharing.
I did. The question was, could you use ESSER 3 funds for teacher salaries? And part of the danger in that is that those ESSER 3 funds are limited. So if you put them into your salaries now, those funds aren't going to come back after this appropriation. So to keep that in mind, the uses, allowable uses, do say other activities that are necessary to maintain the operation of and continuing services, including continuing to employ existing or hiring new LEA and school staff. So it really is a decision that you're going to have to look at long term. Can you support, if you're using ESSER funds now, are you going to be able to support it when those ESSER funds run out? So I have a document that I'm going to throw in the chat for some of these questions. It's from the Fed government. It's on MSBO's website, which I'll send that to. The first one is your list of your fact sheet for the federal funds. And then the second link is to MSBO's federal finance information. And so there's some frequently asked questions there. Both of those may be useful if you've got more detailed questions.
Yeah, and I will follow up on Jen's comment too. Like what we're hearing from a few districts as it relates to employees, if in fact they see sustainability on a raise that might be just a bit outside of the norm. So maybe you've been giving 2% raises and you're going to go to 3%, and you can see where you are going to be able to sustain that raise and that level of compensation, 4 years out. Some districts may be doing that. What we see if districts are going into compensation space, probably the more common thing that's being talked about, and it's early yet, so most districts haven't likely done anything. The thing that's being talked about more is in that one-time payment or bonus space, because that, of course, doesn't bind you as a board into the future, but allows you to provide some compensation to recognize the work that was done and is still being done during COVID and the pandemic, but doesn't set up a legacy cost 3 years from now when the ESSER funds go away. Brad, a couple of questions for you. One was asked already, how many opportunities must be provided in public comment? And that is one, I believe, and somebody else answered that.
That is correct. A lot of boards will offer two, where one offering is for agenda items and the other is for any matters that are within the jurisdiction of the board. I prefer just one opportunity for public comment. To me, that limits your liability, where if you have two, that's just more of a possibility of violating the First Amendment or the Open Meetings Act when you give two bites of the apple like that.
And the other question that's in there is, and this came up, so Tracy clarifying a question. They're streaming, and the question becomes, in essence, do they have to stream the public comment section or just the business section of the meeting? She uses the example of begin the streaming after public comment. The same could be said if you had it at the end of the meeting, that you end the stream. And I know, Brad, we've had some conversations internally about that. Is there a requirement when they offer the streaming and whether they need to include all of it or not?
No, I mean, as long as you're having a traditional in-person meeting, so you're not subject to 3A of the Open Meetings Act that covers virtual meetings. So you're going beyond what's required by the Open Meetings Act by having the streaming. You can pick and choose what parts of the meeting you wish to stream. So if you don't want to stream the public comment portion of it, you can turn it off at that point. And then also another best practice, if you're streaming your meetings, shut off the comment function, okay? That way you don't have to try to regulate those comments. And if you attempt to regulate the comments, you may be violating someone's First Amendment speech, but you're not required to allow people to put comments in, during the live streaming of a meeting. So turn off that function when you're live streaming a meeting.
Patrick asked a question. This is to the group. What are districts doing to attract bus drivers and substitute teachers? I became victim of this problem this week on Monday when I got the text message in the morning that said my son's bus route was canceled due to the lack of a driver that day. And I know we've had whole buildings shut down, or not shut down, but whole buildings lose busing in some of our school districts. And you're seeing some answers there. Offered $2,500 signing bonuses. We upped our sub pay, job fairs, $24 an hour, dollar signs. It's
Great.
It's a tough space.
And I wonder, Don, if the legalization of marijuana as an unintended consequence here is also harming bus driving, because that's still a federal requirement that your bus drivers go through drug testing. And if they have a positive marijuana test, there are a number of things that they have to go through in order for them to be able to drive again. So yeah, while marijuana is legal here in Michigan for recreational purposes, it's still considered an illegal drug at the federal level and is part of the testing for your transportation folks.
The other thing we're hearing anecdotally is Amazon and things like that. You just have to drive a van with your earpods in, and that they're paying more to do that. And so as people shifted when buses weren't running, they're not wanting to come back. And so we're hearing that as part of the problem too.
Well, and a lot of our bus drivers also have tended to be closer to retirement age. And so from a COVID and risk perspective, there are some that have said, hey, even if I've got the vaccine, I'm in an age group of having 35 kids walk past me every day. They see it as a medical risk. And so they're not interested in driving, and they can go drive a tour bus, for Dean, maybe a little more safely, or go drive a Amazon, as Jen mentioned, by themselves and not have the same kind of risk. And so we have seen a shift. I mean, we're actually seeing it, of course, outside of school buses and the semi drivers that have switched over to the Amazon U-Hauls, which is causing some of our supply problems that are out there in the country. Brad, clarifying again Barb's question. They live stream only without the ability for public comment. They can turn off live streaming during the in-person public comment and then turn it back on during the business portion of the meeting.
Yeah, because you're doing that on your own volition. It's not required under the Open Meetings Act. So I wouldn't interpret the Open Meetings Act or the First Amendment to require you to live stream, the public comment portion of the meeting, because you're not required to live stream the meeting under law. So, for example, if you were, taping the meeting as well, I don't think you would have to tape the, part of the public comment portion of the meeting if you chose not to do that, because You're doing that voluntarily. It's not a legal requirement.
And Barb, to that question too, and Brad's answer, I've heard of other districts already doing what you're asking, where they are, they have public comment period at the beginning of their meeting. They turn on their live stream when the actual business meeting starts. That was like over a month ago that I heard of district going in that direction. And Brad is pointing out clearly the legal answer to this and what you have to do or don't have to do according to the law. You as a board will have to decide how that gets viewed by your public if the public comment is not a part of it. And so there's the legal perspective and the public perspective. And that's something that you should discuss, but we're at least trying to provide you, what's the legal, requirement. And in this case, you don't have to have that live streamed, but worthy of a discussion within your district if you're going that direction. Lincoln Park, Brad, our mandate says school-related indoor activities for masks. Is the board meeting a school-related activity?
I don't think it is. Your school board meeting is a limited public forum. It's an open public meeting, so quite different than a school-related activity. So I would not interpret that. I'm assuming that's a county order, or was that a policy, a local policy that was adopted?
Kathy, if you can answer that. I know you're in Lincoln Park, so I know Wayne County has an order, so.
Okay. Well, either way, I based on that language, I would not interpret that as applying to a school board meeting.
Yeah, county order is what it is, Brad.
Okay.
Catherine asks, can the length of time to train new drivers be more flexible in the need crisis for bus drivers? That is, I don't know where all of I know there's certain things within the law in Michigan related to bus drivers. I don't know if there are federal requirements in the training space for bus drivers. That would be a lengthy process to change and, probably just politically a tough thing to navigate just because, bus drivers still are carrying our most precious cargo every day, and to advocate for lessening the standards for having people drive buses, I think could cause problems for folks in that space. But I think probably the bigger problem would be just time. It takes, as Jen can attest, sometimes forever to move legislation through the process.
Don, this is Jeff. Are we able to contribute verbally to the discussion on the bus drivers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, great. Hi, I'm Jeff. I'm the superintendent in Comstock and Kalamazoo. We added paid holidays for our bus drivers. They were astonished by that. Try to treat them like other employees that we have. Ours are a third party outsourced. So it was pretty easy to add that. We just told the company to do so. We also wanted to invest in them during COVID. So when there was a shutdown starting in about March of the 1920 school year until all that ended, we used COVID relief monies to pay them. We reimbursed ourselves. We had already budgeted to pay them. So we thought we should continue to pay them. We didn't want to not pay them, save the money, and then come back afterwards and say, okay, we want to pay you again, and think people would be ready to have their jobs back when they needed to have payments for any other normal expenses that have to keep their families fed and under a house. So that investment kept our bus drivers totally within our district. We haven't had a problem. In fact, we have sub drivers as a result. Depends on how you treat them, I guess.
Jeff, that's a great point. I do think you're building a relationship and kind of building that trust. And it's not bus drivers, but even when MASB's office is closed initially, and we have people that clean our building with the other 4 associations here, and we made a similar call, not knowing how long it was going to last, that, and the janitorial staff, like, because of us being closed, we didn't want to see them kind of punished financially. And so we kind of kept up that same space to make sure that they, were going to still be here when we came back and not disappear and not have anybody to find to clean our space. So we did something similar here. We're coming up on the end. Brad, there was another question. Is it legal for somebody to live stream a board meeting on Facebook as an audience member.
Yeah, and also I see Stan has a question or maybe a comment about a board member recording public comment. I'll address the first question first. Live streaming is akin to recording a meeting. Open Meetings Act permits a community member to record, and in this case, to live stream a meeting, as long as it's not creating a disruption. And it's hard to argue that, someone just holding their phone, live streaming your meeting is creating a disruption. So you couldn't adopt a rule, having them seek permission from the board to do that, or providing notice to the board. They simply have a right to do that under the Open Meetings Act. Now, a board member recording public comment is different. There's case law that indicates, a board by majority vote can control the actions of its members. So in that case, a board member recording public comment from the table, in the board's opinion, could be creating the disruption. And by majority vote, a board could essentially direct the board member to stop that, and indicating that it is disrupting the meeting with that type of action.
Looks like Don, you have your hand up.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I just have a quick question in regards to the Open Meetings Act. In the agenda, if you're going into closed session, that's on the agenda. This, of course, a question for Brad. And the action item says that we're going to go into closed meeting. It resolves that we're going to go into closed meeting and we vote on the action item. Does that allow the president to go into the closed meeting without a vote because it's on the agenda under the action item that we approve?
You always have to go into closed session via a vote. So if you adopted an action item or voted on an action item that is related to your closed session, that doesn't constitute the motion and vote going into closed session. So you need a vote that clearly authorizes the board to meet in closed session. And in some cases that's a majority vote, other cases it's a 2/3 roll call vote, depending upon the reason for the closed session.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Don.
All right, everybody, it is 1 o'clock. We've always stuck to the schedule to keep you recognizing your time and being able to get back to work or whatever you're doing. Thank you all for attending. Thanks for the superintendents that are on today as well and sharing information. Thanks for the sharing back and forth in chat and on voice. I think some of this webinar is about that exactly, to be able to hear from others and learn from each other. So, and Lenore, thank you for the Go Pack Go space. I appreciate
it's buttering up, Don. That's all she's
Well, thank you all. Have a good rest of your week.